Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to another Astroveo Blender tutorial. So today I've got a fun one. I just finished working on this artwork, this little temple on top of a tree stump, and I ended up using a lot of tricks to get it to go from kind of not that great looking to the final product, which I'm pretty happy with. So that's what I want to talk to you guys about today, the kind of secret sauce that I use in my personal artworks to bring it to the finished product, to something that I think looks good. So we're going to be starting with the way the artwork kind of looks when none of these tricks are applied, which is what you're seeing here. So you know, kind of bland and uninteresting, and nothing is really popping or making it look particularly special. But by the end, we're going to have something more like this, which is basically what the final render was. Minus some post-processing and color grading and stuff. So I actually used these techniques fairly recently in an artwork that I was experimenting with macro photography techniques, and a lot of the stuff that I used there, it's like things like bloom and depth of field and floating particulate and volumetrics, I'm going to apply here as well. And this is a little animation that I made showing the render go from the start to the finish. And you can see how these additions sort of make it look more realistic and more interesting and artistic. And we're going to be doing something very similar today, but with this artwork. So let's get right into it. This is the scene that I've prepped. It's basically the artwork with just the model and before any of the additions that I think make it look better. And so you can see we have the scene set up in the same spot. I'm going to let it render, and I apologize if you can hear my fan spin up. It's a pretty hefty scene. So, normally when I'm rendering stuff for you guys in real time, I'll turn off some of the more complicated particle systems and stuff, but I actually want you to see how everything looks. So we might be listening to my fans a lot today. So you can see the artwork as it is here, and this is how it might start out as I'm experimenting with stuff with just, you know, an image plane background, very simple lighting in the form of a sun lamp illuminating it just directly from the front. So nothing particularly interesting or anything to write home about. But I'm going to show you how we can go from this to this in a couple of pretty simple steps. So first we're going to go through how to light the scene and the different stages of lighting you can use to make the scene feel more realistic. And next we're going to go through camera effects, particularly depth of field and the balance you need to strike with it, and then the special effects, so things like the mists and the bokeh in the background, and then finally the post-processing and coloring that we do. I'm going to go briefly over that, but just the kind of things that I like to hit to bring out the best in the scene. So let's dive right into it, and let's start with the lighting. If you're doing the lighting correctly, your render should be interesting to look at without any textures. So let me show you what I mean here. So the way you can turn off textures in Blender is you can just go to, on the right panel here, the view layer properties, and then click down here is a little section called override, and you can choose a material to override everything. Basically, all the materials in your scene will get set to this one. So I think I'm using some sort of clay material as my default here. But so if we set all the materials in the scene to this clay, including the image background, which was not what I intended, but if we set it to this clay, you can see how the lighting is affecting the mesh without being misled by any of the textures. And so right now we just have very forward direct lighting, which is good when you're setting up a scene because it helps you see what's going on. But because the lighting is so forward and direct, there's not many shadows, and shadows, you know, where the light isn't going really does more to help the scene than the lighting itself. So just at a basic level, if we rotate the sun lamp, you can see how it's changing the character of the scene. And so instead of having the light forward directed, you know, if we point it off to the side, so basically if the scene isn't front lit, if we instead make it side lit, you can immediately see how even without any textures, there's still volume and presence to the mesh now, because the elements are casting shadows. And so the temple up here on the tree stump is casting shadows on itself, or rather, you know, parts of it are in shadow, parts of it aren't. The rock, it gives this like a texture to the scene by itself, in the absence of any textures. And this is really, really important to get a handle on your scene. And I like to do all my lighting with no textures activated, because textures can make it hard to see what's really happening. You know, if a texture is dark, it can make the lighting seem like it's better or worse than it actually is. And so this is how I like to start. I like to start by just turning off all the textures, activating my sun lamp, and moving it around and seeing what I like the best. And when I started this scene, there was a couple things I really liked. I really liked the way it looked when it was lit from the side in particular. So having the shadows on the right side and the lighting on the left. And I liked this vibe to it. You know, it made it feel a little bit mysterious, like almost like there was a sunset happening. But you could also, it highlighted a lot of the details in the tree and the branches and the flowers, and all this wonderful stuff happening on the tree trunk. And so even though you could just start from this, a sun lamp is almost never the way to go. So what I would call stage one, which would be this, you do this for step first, and this will immediately kind of improve the result of your render, is I would get rid of any sort of sun lamps and stuff that you might have. So I'm just going to turn this down to 0, and instead I would incorporate an HDRI. So you can download an HDRI from a number of websites. If you just look up HDRI free download, I think there's one called HDRI Haven that's fantastic. I use that one a lot. But you find an HDRI that you like and download it and just add it here by going to environment texture and then adding an image. And you can turn up the I'm going to turn up the brightness on my HDRI here so you can see what it looks like. And now we have this forest HDRI, which is going to set the background. And because we have this nice thing in the background, we don't need this stupid image plane anymore. And image planes are the way I used to make creative backgrounds, but HDRI is almost always the way to go. So I'm just going to get rid of this image plane entirely. Where is it in here? Here we go. So I'm just going to turn it off completely. So now you can see we've got some nice stuff in the background. And if we go to the world view, we can rotate the environment, and you can see how it affects the lighting. And so when the light is in the back, the sun is in the back, the scene will be backlit. But if we rotate it around, and I think I had it at around 113 degrees, we can make the scene side lit, just like we wanted to from the sun lamp. And honestly, let's turn off textures real quick. This is a really good, I call this stage one because this is the first thing you should be doing. If we turn the textures back on and allow the scene to re-render, you can see that already the lighting looks more interesting if a little bit dim, and we can turn that up so you can kind of see the scene a little bit better. But the lighting looks more interesting, way more interesting now that it's not front lit. We're getting kind of, some dark areas and some light areas, and as a good first step, this is fine. But I didn't stop here for this particular artwork. I actually had 3 stages of lighting. This is just stage 1. But stage 2 actually involves ditching the HDRI a little bit and instead using area lamps to make the lighting how you want. So I want this to be lit from one side and shadowy on the other, and you can have an HDRI and just put it in there, but you can't control all the precise features of the lighting in the HDRI. So while it's good for a background and setting the scene and getting sort of a bulk uniform lighting like this, where you just have a non-specific lighting that gives a sort of baseline lighting to the scene, you really want to get in there and start controlling the lighting manually with area lamps. And so if you just add an area light here, you can see now what it's doing is it's rectangle, and it's casting the light in a rectangular shape downwards. We can turn up the brightness, and then we can rotate it, make it bigger or smaller to make it more or less diffuse. And you can see immediately how this is resulting in a much more customizable lighting setup. So for this render, I had 2 area lamps set up on the side here. They're these 2 big rectangles, and one of them was smaller and as a result cast stronger shadows, and then the other one was a little bit bigger and more diffuse and cast less sharp shadows. And I like having this kind of two-layer setup. You can also mix and match colors of the lamps, which will make it seem a little bit prettier, depending on what kind of, you know, sub and surface level lightings you want in your scene. But yeah, so having this kind of area light setup immediately makes the render feel better lit. Like, you've got this stronger lighting on the side here, and a little bit of shadowy stuff going on here. I like the uniform lighting that the HDRI is casting, but because the HDRI is all around the image, the shadows aren't strong enough in my opinion. So the next part of the stage 2 lighting is to add something I call a shadow plane. I'm not sure if there's an actual name for it, but basically it's a plane that is off to the side, colored black, that will absorb light and cast more shadows. And so, you know, you can turn down the specular all the way if you want it to completely avoid casting light. You can see how this is doing. But basically, I just take a plane, I color it black, and I use that to redirect the shadows in the scene. So you can see that if we turn off this plane, this shadow plane, which I'm going to give it a better name, shadow plane. If we turn off the shadow plane, which has now vanished, the lighting isn't as strong. Like the shadows aren't as strong. But when we turn it on, suddenly one side of the image becomes much darker than the other. And so we're already off to a really nice start here. And this is actually pretty much the lighting that I went with. You could make it stronger or softer. I wanted something kind of on the soft end. I didn't want it to be too harsh. I wanted it to feel warm and welcoming. So you can see that in post I brightened it up quite a bit, but there's also these lightings, and this is stage 3, secondary lighting in the mesh itself. So to achieve this secondary lighting, what I effectively did here was I added these little lamps to the scene and then gave them each their own point light, mimicking lamplight. And I use this in a lot of my renders. I'm a big fan of soft lamplight that adds like an orange warm glow. And I've organized the lights into the upper and lower lights so you can turn them on and off as a group. And that's another thing that I strongly recommend you add to your render if it makes sense in context, is to consider how the scene itself will be lit outside of the special lighting that you're doing. And this scene is definitely lit. This is a little temple. It's got these little lights, and the lights will be casting some level of glow onto the scene. And so if we turn up the upper level lights up to, let's say, 500 milliwatts, you can see that it adds this really warm glow. And now we can do the same thing for the bottom lights, and it casts this nice warm glow on the whole scene. And that's how I got this nice contrast of nice lighting, side lighting, which casts nice shadows thanks to the shadow plane, plus the HDRI making the whole scene better lit, and then on top of it, the sub lighting, the secondary lighting in the mesh itself, which adds another dimension to the artwork. And so that's it for the lighting. So let's move on to the next step. So the next step will be camera effects. Basically, the main one here is depth of field. But at the moment, if we were to render this, and you can actually see it in the kind of first stage, it's kind of difficult to distinguish the foreground artwork, the foreground mesh, from the background HDRI. Lighting helps with this, but depth of field is really a big thing. And depth of field does a bunch of other stuff as well. So it removes imperfections, since it makes things just a little bit more fuzzier, adds realism, it helps you separate the foreground from the background, and it blends the foreground and background lighting better together. This is everything just a little bit, transitioning just a little bit smoother. So in Blender, the way you activate depth of field is you click on the camera, and then you just check off this depth of field box here. And now what I like to do is I like to add an empty to the scene, this empty right here, and I call it depth of field, and I choose it as the focus point in the camera. So that's what this selection is here. You just click here and choose depth of field as the focus object. And now if we check off depth of field, we're going to see the effect. You can see the background is a little bit blurrier. The rocks have fuzzed out just a teeny bit. But if we select the depth of field empty, we can now see that if we select the depth of field empty, we can now see that if we move it around, it changes the depth of field characteristics of the scene. So if we move it closer to the camera, you can see the whole render blurs out. Whereas if we move it into the structure, it goes into focus, and so on. And the nice thing is the HDRI is like infinitely far away, so it'll always be a nice level of blurred. And you can control the size of the depth of field just by changing the f-stop. So if we bring the f-stop up to 10, it's kind of like having no depth of field at all. And if we bring it down to 0.2, it's like having way too much. So experimenting with this and finding a balance where you can see the details in the background, but then also, you know, it's adding this nice level of blur and realism. That's really, really important. And I would say it's one of the biggest differences between the sort of bad looking render here and the final render that kind of adds this level of focus and artisticness to it. And it certainly was a big thing for the macro photography render. I would actually argue that the depth of field is the single biggest change between the non-macro render and it looking like a macro photography render, which makes sense because that's what macro photography is. But it really can't be understated. And I'm not saying I know it sounds like easy, just depth of field, but you have to work with what the scene is giving you and try to make it look realistic. You can't just turn on depth of field and call it a day. Okay, so that's the camera effects. So let's move on to the next step. The next step is special effects. This is the kind of stuff that you add to the scene to make it look more magical, more realistic. In this case, for the bad render, we have nothing activated, but the two main things that I added here are mist, which you can see floating around, and this particulate effect in the background. And now these are both achieved via image planes. So I've got a new Blender scene opened up here, and I'll just show you very briefly how that works. Let me turn off the rendering here. Basically, you're going to want to go to something like Google, maybe Google Images, and just look up mist texture. And you'll get a lot of these wonderful images that have this mist floating around. Now, depending on what kind of mist you want, that'll inform what kind of image you choose. I wanted something like this image, a fog overlay, since I wanted it to kind of curl throughout the scene as opposed to just being, just permeating throughout the scene. I wanted it to be fixed, constrained to a particular region. So once you have the image that you want downloaded, let's hop into the rendered view here with Eevee, and I'm going to load in an images as a plane. So you can go to Shift A and then Image, and let's go to here, and you can pick the image that you wanted. So I've downloaded this particular image, and now you can see that in the render, it's showing up as this like faint mist texture on a black background. So open up your shader editor, and the easiest way to make your mist work is, assuming it doesn't have transparency already, just disconnect that and take the output from the color node and plug it into the alpha. And now your render, if we, for the purpose of this, I'm going to make this a little bit easier to see by turning the world background down and plugging the color into the emission. So it should make it glow now. There you go. And if we turn up the emission strength, we can see it. So now the mist is transparent. So if we add an object behind it, let's give this, let's add some sunlighting just so we can see what's going on here. So if we add this object, we can now see that the mist stays in front of it and can float around in the scene pretty realistically. And honestly, you can stop here. I like to add levels of transparency. So right now you can see that the mist is completely opaque. But if you add another mixed shader and add a transparent BSDF, you can control how transparent it is, which will make the mist look more realistic or less realistic depending on what you're going for. Like a more cartoonish thing, you can have no opacity. If you want something a little bit, where you can see through it, it'll help make it look more realistic. On top of this, it's really easy to get a 3D mist effect just by adding multiple mist planes and rotating them. And you'll have mist that sort of floats realistically throughout the scene. And that's actually exactly what I did for this artwork. So if we activate the mist planes here, that's these three. You can see that's just 3 planes that are layered throughout the scene. And let's turn them back off and go into rendered mode. Okay, here we go, and you can see if I activate them, oops, that's the wrong one. You can see how they appear throughout the scene. So 1, 2, and 3. And it just adds this nice level of realism. I'm not totally sure why mist makes my brain happy when I kind of look at an image like this. I think that we sort of associate mist with like realistic weather effects and like something that can't be controlled or really easily faked. Although it is not that hard, as I've just shown, but our brains maybe don't think it is, and so adding mist makes something feel more realistic and cinematic. And so that's honestly all I do for the mist. But there's an additional effect that I like to do, which is adding this like floating bokeh in the background of the scene. So if you look over here, sorry, if you look over here, you can see that there's this floating particle effect in the background that looks like a bokeh. I've added that to the scene here, and it's very, very easy to achieve. You just go to Google Images, look up bokeh, maybe particles, and pick an image you like. I think I went with something like this, where it's got this like multiple layers of particles floating around in this background color, and then you just add it to your scene the same way. Shift A, image, images, planes, and this is the image that I've added here. You can see it's this image plane back here. You want to put it far enough back from the camera that the natural depth of field takes over. It makes it look super realistic. And then you can almost use an image like this to like pre-color grade the scene as part of your render. So by controlling the amount of red in it, for example, I took the image from feeling a little bit colder, where it just looks blue in the background, to a little bit more warmer, which I like my artworks to be kind of warm feeling. So that's honestly all for the special effects. Just adding this depth of field and bokeh to the background really helps. So in this render, for example, the macro photography one, just adding the depth of field did that, and then just adding the bokeh to the background, here's the depth of field difference, and then there's the bokeh with the particles. And it really, really helps to make the scene feel more realistic, like there's more details and stuff going on, even though you haven't actually added that much, those are my favorite tricks, where you can kind of add detail without too much effort, kind of like the Bob Ross approach, where you just a trick with the paintbrush makes it look like there's something there. So that's all for the special effects. So now we'll move on to the last bit. We'll render this and take a look at the post-processing. Now we've done the special effects, and we want to know how to get it, to look like this final render, which is actually this one on the right here. And so I'm going to show you the steps I do in Blender and outside of Blender to make it look like this. So one of the easiest tricks I like to use for doing for post-processing is adding a little bit of blur. So when you start by looking at an image sort of as it is, it can often have these really sharp edges where materials end, or the mesh end, or the mesh has edges and creases that are way sharper than anything you'd experience in real life, because real life is not as clean and neat as a 3D render, unfortunately. So one of the easiest ways to get rid of this problem is to just add a little bit of blur to the scene. So you can see that this is rendered at low resolution because just for the purposes of this tutorial, but you can see stuff like, maybe the staircase feels a little bit too sharp, or the flowers are a little too sharp. By adding a teeny bit of blur, which I'm adding right now, you can see that it just makes it look less pixelated, less sharp. Sorry for the motorcycle in the background there. It makes it look a little bit less pixelated, less sharp, and that adds overall to the realism. Now I'm using actually 0.1% here to communicate the effect, but in the actual render I only used 0.05%. It's a very subtle effect, and it will scale depending on the resolution of your scene. So once again, as with all things, I suggest play around and see if you can get it the way you like it. The next thing I like to add is glare. Glare adds a lot of warmth to the scene and can make it feel more realistic, since it's a camera effect. And so to add glare, you can just add the glare node and plug it into your compositing pipeline. And you can see now that it just makes the lamps feel more glowy and warm, and makes the whole scene feel a little bit more realistic. So the couple things that you're going to watch out for: the size of the glare. Depending on if you put it all the way down, it basically looks like there's no glare. Putting it all the way up is not always a good idea either, but in this case I actually like it because I'm choosing to have I'm choosing to threshold pretty sharply here. So if the default threshold is 1, you can see it's going to make the whole scene look dimmer. But if you bring it down to 0.2, it'll just highlight the lamps. Going all the way down to 0 will make it highlight the whole scene, which can be a vibe, honestly. I mean, I don't hate the way that looks. Now we're going to just add 0.2 though. It improves the contrast, highlights just the lit bits, and it makes the scene look better overall. Once you're done with that, the question is now how do we get from this image on the left here, which is the output of just Blender, to the image on the right where it looks a little bit more vibrant. And here's what I like to do basically for my artworks. So I like to color grade the scene, and the thing I try to go for to color grade the scene is realism. So I'll try to look at references of real flowers, real trees, and try to get the colors to match. But then I like to emphasize the unique colors in the scene. So if I were to think about the color palette for the scene, there's this ruddy orange glow from the lamps, there's this purple from the flowers, and there's the green from the moss. And you can see that the color grading that I've done here, which you can use in any sort of app, I just use honestly macOS Photos, which has a ton of great tools. You can see that I've emphasized, I made the green a little bit brighter, the purple a little bit sharper and more blue, and I've allowed the lamps to sort of fill the scene a little bit more with the color grading. I've also increased the contrast to emphasize the shadows, and added a vignette to bring attention to the main focus. And even though it doesn't look like a whole lot, for me it helps bring the whole scene together. And so don't neglect post-processing. Honestly, with just a little bit of post-processing, a lot of renders can be brought from, you know, good to the way they can to really bring out their potential. But I don't see it too much because I think that it's best done outside of Blender. Blender's post-process tools aren't as fast or fantastic. Like, you know, you can absolutely post-process in Blender. Like, you know, if you want to change, you know, do a hue correction or change the saturation and value or and contrast and all this stuff, you can do all that stuff in Blender. But the problem is, if you have a really complex node map in your compositor and you want to just change a color a little bit, you got to sit and wait for 15 seconds for it to rerun the whole thing if you're on a, you know, just a regular laptop like mine. So I totally get why people might not want to do the post-processing in Blender itself, but you just export the image, pump it into your favorite tool, spend 10-15 minutes just doing a little bit of color editing, and it can really bring the scene out. So thanks so much for watching, guys. I know this was a little bit more informal, just me talking about kind of what makes the scene tick, but I hope this helps you take your renders from you know, stage 1 to stage whatever, and it helps you make something that you like more. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. I know I kind of went through this in not so much a tutorial style, but more like a discussion. And I'd love to hear your feedback. And let me know if you apply these techniques. Send us your artworks and what you've used. So thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.